This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, July 2006. Warlord of Kor by Terry Carr. Chapter 1. Lee Ryanson sat forward on the faded red stone seat, watching the stylus of the interpreter as the massive gray being in front of him spoke, its dry, leathery mouth slowly and stumblingly forming the words of a spoken language its race had not used for over 30,000 years. The stylus made no sound in the thin air of hurlage as it passed over the plasticine notepaper. The only sounds in the ancient building were those of the alien's surprisingly high and thin voice, coming at intervals, and Ryanson's own slightly labored breathing. He did not listen to the alien's voice. By now he had heard it often enough so that it was merely irritating in its thin dryness, like old parchments being rubbed together. He watched the stylus as it jumped along sporadically. Tebron Marl was our priest, king, hero. Not priest, but one who knew. That is, priest. Ryanson was a slender, sandy-haired man in his late 20s. A sharp scar from a knife cut left a line across his forehead over his right eyebrow. His eyes, perhaps brown, perhaps green, the light on hurlage was sometimes deceptive, were soft, but narrowed with an intent alertness. He raised the interpreter's mic and said, "How long ago?" The stylus recorded the Earthman's question, too. But Ryanson did not watch it. He looked up at the bulk of the alien, watching for the slow closing of its eyes, so slow that it could not be called a blink. That would show it had understood the question. The interpreter could feed the question direct to the telepathic alien, but there was no guarantee that it would be understood. The eyes resting steadily on him closed and opened, and in a few moments came the Hurlage's dry voice. The Great Age was in the 18th generation past, 7,000 years ago. Ryanson calculated quickly, translating that to about 8,200 Earth Standard Years, and subtracting. That would make it about the 17th century, about the time of the Restoration in England, when the western hemisphere of Earth was still being colonized, 18 generations ago on hurlage. He read the date into the mic for the stylus to record, and sat back and stretched. They were sitting amid the ruins of a vast hall, gray dust covering the stone floor all around them. Dry, hard vegetation had crept in through cracks and breaks in the walls, and fallen across the dusty interior shadows of the building. Occasionally, a small, quick animal would dart from a dark wall across the floor to another shadow, its feet soundless in the dust. Above Ryanson, the enormous arch of the Hurlage dome loomed darkly against the deep cerulean blue of the sky. The lines of all Hurlage architecture were deceptively simple, but Ryanson had already found that if he tried to follow the curves and angles, he would soon find his head swimming. There was a quality to these ancient buildings which was not quite understandable to a Terran mind, as though the old Hurlage had built them on geometric principles just slightly at a tangent from those of Earth. The curve of the arch drew Ryanson's eyes along its silhouette almost hypnotically. He caught himself and shook his head, and turned again to the alien before him. The creature's name, as well as it could be tendered in a Terran script, was Hrong. The head of the alien was dark and hairless, leathery, weathered. The light wires of the interpreter trailed down and across the floor from where they were clamped to the deep indentations of the temples. Massive bony ridges circled the shadowed eyes, set low on the head, directly above the wide mouth which always hung open while the Hurligi breathed in long gulps of air. 2 atrophied nostrils were situated on either side and slightly below the eyes. The neck was so thick and massive that it was practically non-existent, blending the head with the shoulders and trunk, on which the dry skin stretched so thin that Ryanson could see the solid bone of the chest wall. 2 squat arms hung from the shoulders, terminating in 4-digited hands, on which 2 sets of blunt fingers were apposed. Hurrong kept moving them constantly, in what Ryanson automatically interpreted as a nervous habit. The lower body was composed of 2 heavily muscled legs, jointed, so that they could move either forward or backward, and the feet had 4 stubby but powerful toes radiating from the center. The Hurligi wore a dark garment of something which looked like wood fiber, hanging from the head and gathered together by a cord just below the chest wall. Ryanson, since arriving on the planet 3 weeks before as one of a team of 15 archaeological workers, had been interviewing Hurrong almost every day. But still, he often found himself remembering only with difficulty that this was an intelligent being. Hurrong was so slow-moving and uncommunicative most of the time that he almost seemed like a mound of leather, like a pile of hides thrown together in a corner. But he was intelligent, and in his mind he held perhaps the entire history of his race. Ryanson lifted the interpreter mic again. Was Tebron Marl king of all Hurlage? Hurrong's eyes slowly closed and opened.
Tebron Marl was ruler, leader, in the region of mines. He united all of Hurlage and was priest ruler.
How did he unite the planet?
Tebron lived at the end of the barbaric age. He conquered the planet by violence and drove the ancient priest caste from the temple.
But the reign of Tebron Marl is remembered as an era of peace.
When he was priest king, he held the peace. He ended the barbaric age.
Ryanson suddenly sat forward, watching the stylus record these words. Then it was Tebron who abolished war on Hurlage?
Yes.
Ryanson felt a thrill go through him. This was what they had all been searching for. The point in the history of Hurlage when wars had ceased, when the Hurligi had given themselves over to completely peaceful living. He knew already that the transition had been sharp and sudden. It was the last question mark in the sketchy history of Hurlage which the survey team had compiled since its arrival. How had the Hurligi managed so abruptly to establish and maintain an era of peace which had lasted unbroken to the present? It was difficult even to think of these huge, slow-moving creatures as warriors. But warriors they had been for thousands of their years, gradually building their culture and science until, apparently almost overnight, the wars had ceased. Since then, the Hurligi moved in their slow way through their world, growing more complacent with the passage of ancient generations, growing passive and eventually decadent. Now there were only some 24 of the race left alive. They were telepathic, these leathery aliens, and behind those shadowed eyes they held the entire memories of their race. Experiences communicated telepathically through the centuries had formed a memory pool which each of the remaining Hurligi shared. They could not, of course, integrate in their own minds all of that immense store of memories and understand it all clearly, but the memories were there. It was at the same time a boon and a trial for Ryanson and the rest of the survey team. They were trained archaeologists, as well schooled as possible on the worlds of this far-flung sector near the constantly outward moving edge. The limit of Terran